My name is Paul Warmington. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Birmingham, England, and along with Dave, I work in the new Centre for Research in Race and Education at Birmingham. I've worked in education, what we call further and higher education in the UK, for about 25 years, working around equalities, race equalities, access to higher education in particular.
And I'm Dave Gillborn. I'm Professor of Critical Race Studies at the University of Birmingham. I've been at Birmingham for a year. Before that, for 20 years, I was at the Institute of Education in London. And all of my research focuses on race inequalities in education. I use quantitative methods, qualitative methods. I particularly focus at the moment around issues in education policy and how policy which presents itself as being about including everyone and raising overall standards somehow always seems to reproduce the existing inequalities and quite often make things worse at the very same time that it pretends to make things better. The work that we do is always controversial and disliked by many for raising very difficult questions around racism. So both of us and our other colleague Nicola Rollock, who works in the centre, we all draw very explicitly on critical race theory as part of our framework for understanding the world. And whilst we use a kind of intersectional approach where we want to look at how racism operates sometimes with, sometimes through other dimensions of difference like gender, sexuality, social class. We're very certain about the fact that we want to keep a focus on racism absolutely clear in our work. Because what happens, certainly in the UK and also very much across Europe, is that words like diversity are used, and they're used as a kind of code to pretend that all of these differences are being addressed. But then when you actually look at the work, diversity translates into work around poverty or work around gender. And racism and race equality is often kind of forgotten. Or it's assumed that, well, if we address poverty, we'll address racism. Yeah. And that is not the case.
And I think underpinning that, therefore, is a focus on the sense in which societies actually produce difference. So we're not old-fashioned race relations theorists who assume that there's one ethnic group over here, another over here, and they just happen to be different and unequal. The differences in affluence, education, and so forth are part of what produce those groups, those differences. We know race is a social construction, and that's the position we work from. I guess I always talk about race as an as-if category. I don't believe that race exists in a biological or scientific sense. As I said, race is a social construction, but that shouldn't be taken as an indication that it's somehow not important, or that it's merely a kind of expression of other more important, more real differences, such as class. The point is that we tend to live and to structure societies as if race did exist. And for me, that's basic racial realism. That's what matters. So for me, race therefore is a set of social practices and identifications, and racism, if you like, for me is one of those key social practices. It's not the only one. There are lots of forms of race that we do, some of which may be relatively harmless. But there are other harmful expressions where people's life chances, where people's lives are structured and impacted upon because of this as-if belief in race as a real thing, and that's racism.
So race is often assumed to be a kind of natural, obvious given. When you study race and racism, it becomes clear that race is constantly redefined and contested. So if you look at how groups are assumed to exist at the moment, if you go back in time, certain groups, classically the Irish in the US, have only been viewed as white relatively recently in terms of a historical span. And those decisions about who gets to be privileged as white are political decisions. They're not accidental, and they're certainly not a simple reading off of skin tone. These are issues about power. And one of the things that I try and do in my work in particular is when I see the word race, I also imagine behind the word race a slash in the word racism. Because if you see, for example, in a newspaper story, it says race differences in educational achievement. When I see that, I take race differences in educational achievement to be an indication of the presence of racism within the system. Because there's no reason why kids in any one particular group necessarily do better than kids in another. But when policymakers and many teachers see race differences in achievement, they see race as a real category that denotes for them deficit. So if there's a race group not doing very well, they assume it's the group's fault. They're not clever enough, they're too lazy, they're too delinquent, they're too poor. So for me, the word race is always accompanied by the word racism. You can't have a discussion about race without racism always being in play in some way.
And you see there the way in which race is created both out of material circumstances and ideological circumstances. So on the one hand, the inequalities that you get in funding, achievement, they're kind of material differences, inequalities. And then you have the explanations about laziness, cultural deficit, family problems, which are the ideological layer, which kind of combine to sort of just reproduce this idea that we have these separate and possibly unequal ethnic racial groups, which is racism.
How does inequality happen? Sometimes it happens very simply, sometimes it happens in very complex ways. But inequality tends to happen to the same groups over time. So if you look at, it's always good to take an example and then you can start to look at examples that are different or similar. So if you look at things like differences in academic achievement, oftentimes policymakers will say, well, this is a really intractable problem. Why is it that black students in the UK, so students with family origins in Africa or the Caribbean, persistently over the decades do less well on average than white students? In the States, why is it that African American students persistently as a group do less well? And they look for issues with it, deficiencies within the students. What they often don't do is to say, well, how does the school system treat these students differently? And when you look at it, you find that, well, they're systematically underrepresented in gifted groups. They're overrepresented in lower status teaching tracks in the States, sets in the UK. They're actually put in groups, whereas they move through the system, it becomes, in some cases, literally impossible for them to achieve because they haven't covered the curriculum, they haven't been exposed to the best teachers. And in the UK, for some students that have constantly been put at the bottom of the tracking system, they actually wind up taking exams where the very highest grades are simply not available to them. So in some senses, that's brutally simple. You put kids in a group and say, you cannot get the highest grades. The inequality is assured and it's created by the system. But it's highly complex in as much as when you start looking at how do those kids wind up there, you start raising some very contentious questions about how racist stereotyping works through very common sense assumptions that most teachers bring to the classroom and to their work, and assumptions which are not challenged through teacher education or through education policy.
Yeah, that's right. So, there are many well-meaning studies of race and education that tend to focus entirely on what black students or black families do and their backgrounds and so forth, which is kind of fine. But it can easily, as Dave implies, just sort of slide into a deficit model. And I think one of the things about the critical race theory place from which we work is that, we don't just look at what black families, black communities, black students do. You also have to look at the racialized practices of white people and of institutions. These are not neutral spaces.
There's an interesting kind of truism that gets used in some management courses where they say that every organization is perfectly designed to deliver the results that it delivers. Now, education systems in the UK across Europe, in North America, and in Australia produce racialized outcomes. Those are not accidental. We know how the outcomes are produced, and the fact that they continue demonstrates that the system really doesn't view equalizing results as essential. If it did, then policy priorities and practices would be different. If you seriously wanted to equalise attainment, you would have to do something about the disproportionate expulsion of black students and the disproportionate placement of them in low teaching tracks and teaching sets. And the fact that when you raise that question, you're looked at as if you're claiming that the earth is flat, demonstrates the true value that education systems place on race equality.
And it's no surprise that the critical race theory and other critical approaches to looking at racial inequalities, it's no surprise that they are viewed as quite dangerous, because they ask a very unsettling question that Dave is getting at here, which is that very often when we look at unequal racial outcomes in education, the assumption is that, oh, these unequal outcomes happen because something has gone wrong, somewhere. But again, what Dave is saying is, well, actually, what if the inequalities are actually evidence that, in fact, the outcomes are exactly as they were designed to be? It's not that something has gone wrong, it's that we have business as usual.
Because if you're a teacher or a school principal, you have a set of demands upon you. And you also bring your own personal commitments. Some people have a commitment to the school, to their own discipline, or to equity. And you will have to start balancing those different constraints that you face and the commitments that you want to deliver. Now, if you look at schools, high schools, elementary schools, and indeed universities, which are serious about social justice, they produce very different outcomes to often so-called elite schools, which simply say, well, we don't worry about those things because we just cater for the best. Now, oftentimes those are explained or justified as, well, we don't have a choice, we have to produce certain outcomes because we're constrained by performance measures. But different schools in relatively similar positions can prioritise these matters and go about teaching and discipline and staff recruitment and staff progression in very different ways. And those things make a difference.
Yes. And the thing is, we're not radical pessimists. These kinds of things have happened and do happen at a local level all the time. And there have been many moments, many instances, the work of certain teacher and parent movements in London in the 70s and 80s and so forth, where there has been a real local effort to rethink the system, to rethink pedagogy, to rethink resourcing and so forth, and to rethink the ways in which those produce, again and again, racial inequalities. And there have been really positive outcomes at the local level.
But these things are questions of power.
Yes.
And there is a sense in which whenever school districts, individual schools, universities begin to address race equality, there is often a sense amongst white communities, white students, that they are somehow under attack. Almost as if white folks have a kind of zero-sum view of race equality, that if there's a drive for anti-racism, that somehow that's going to damage white people. Now, clearly, that's not how good anti-racist reform works. It's about equity. It's not about changing favourites. But these are matters of power. And if you are serious about raising the proportion of African American kids in gifted classes, then you will be reducing the proportion of other groups in gifted classes. And that has real material consequences. And people are unhappy. White people, by and large, benefit from the racial status quo.
Yes.
This is not a kind of detached academic discussion. People identify their own and their children's interests in these discussions.
So it's the difference between aspiration and actual change. You know, you'll often see institutions with fine mission statements, but when you realise the changes it will make in numbers or power balances, then there's a drawing back from actual practice, actual change.